The Mount of Olives, the traditional site of Jesus' ascension as told in Acts, is about 2,500 feet above sea level at its highest peak. And that means that before he was lifted up into heaven, Jesus led his followers up a mountain, up into the clouds. Sister Joan Chittister has noted that mountains in Greek, Hebrew, Roman, and Asian religious literature were always places where the human could reach and touch the divine. Mountains are what Celtic Christians would have termed a thin place, a place so elevated that the veil that exists between earth and heaven, between human and divine, it seems to thin so that it's easy to see God, to hear God's voice, to sense in that thin place God's Spirit lifting you. Heaven and earth, the Celtic saying goes, are only 3 feet apart. But in thin places, that distance grows even shorter. And so atop that mountain, it was as if those disciples could reach and touch the edge of heaven itself. In fact, that's what they seem to be trying to do as Jesus ascends in our passage. This scene is one of the most widely known and widely painted in Christian art. And in many depictions, the disciples are rendered with their arms outstretched, standing on their tiptoes, grasping at Jesus' feet, their hands open, reaching for his robes as he stretched out beyond them, trying to take hold of him, perhaps wanting him to stay there with him, or even more, I think, hoping that some of the glory that surrounds him on that mountain and in those clouds will sweep them up with him into that great beyond all that seems to limit, and keep them grounded here on earth. That's so often what we seek from God. That's so often what we search for in our lives of faith and following after Jesus. We want to ascend to those places. We want to be on the mountaintop amidst the dazzling light, the grand view, the glory bouncing off of Jesus onto all of us who surround. We stretch out our arms to reach it. We strain our necks to see it. And that's right when we hear the words from these two figures in white that approach in Acts 1 and say, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking up toward heaven?" Because the ascension is not ultimately a story of Jesus going up, so much as it is a story of his disciples going down, of lowering their gaze, descending down the mountain into the places that he has called them to be after he is gone. Jesus has a word for this. He pronounces the word upon them before he rises, almost like a mountaintop ordination. Witness is the word. You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth, he says. A witness. This word, witness, is a pervasive theme throughout early Christianity and early Christian literature, and we can trace its development through the years. And at first and foremost, for those early Christians, the word meant eyewitness. A witness was an eyewitness who had had a personal encounter and thus a direct link to the divine in Jesus Christ, one who had seen and felt and touched and experienced for themselves. And that describes any of these disciples who had followed him this far up to that mountain. By then they had experienced him as risen Lord, the one who had kept his promise and made it back, and that's why they had followed him that far, because they had witnessed it with their own eyes. It was not the view of that empty tomb that changed their lives. It was not a testimony from another of his followers. It was when they encountered him for themselves. It was when Mary was in the garden and she saw one who looked to her to be simply the gardener, but then that gardener knew her name, Mary. It was when Thomas was with the others. He was locked behind the doors when Jesus came through those barriers and stood there before him. And Thomas said, "My Lord and my God." He witnessed it himself. It was when the two were on that Emmaus road, Cleopas and his friend, and they walked some miles down the road with Jesus before they turned their heads and they realized who had been with them all along. It was when Peter saw him on the shore and understood that amidst all the missteps that had led him on his clumsy journey to that point, the love of Christ was still reaching out to him, still showing up for him, still believing in him. Peter witnessed it himself. Because resurrection is not simply something that happened off in the distance somewhere. It's something that happens still. It's something that we witness. And for some of them, for some of us, that is the very substance of faith ultimately. And many of us just want to stay in that place of witness, recalling what He has meant to us, all of the times He has lifted us, gathering around Him for as long as He will stay, and reaching out our hands as He goes. But witness means more than that. It's not simply a reference to those who have seen, those who have caught sight or been eyewitnesses to Christ's risen life. No, the evidence that Christ has risen is, as Peter Gomes has said, a transformed Easter people. Because witness also means those who have been transformed. A witness is the one who can testify to the gospel of Christ's life, death, and resurrection. A life that is not simply something you see, it is something that you bear. It is something that you give evidence of, something you yourself bring to life. Some of you have heard me reference the 2009 HBO film entitled Taking Chance, based on real-life events of Lieutenant Colonel Michael Strobel, a volunteer military escort officer who is accompanying in the film the body of 19-year-old Marine Chance Phelps and seeing him back to his hometown of Dubois, Wyoming. It's a beautiful story, a wonderful film, a fitting watch for this Memorial Day weekend. Many poignant scenes throughout the film, like one in which Colonel Strobel, who is played by Kevin Bacon, stops along the way and has a conversation with a man in that small town who had known Chance Phelps his whole 19 years. And this man standing in that service station of this small Wyoming town thanks Colonel Strobel for his service. He thanks him for bringing Chance back home. He thanks him for being present to honor his memory. And then he says, "Sir, you are his witness now. And without a witness, we fade away." Jesus' word about witness, it's a call to them. It's a call to us. Don't let me fade away. Give witness, give life to this kingdom that we have dreamed about and given ourselves to, because in the absence of vivid, courageous, bold pictures of my life, people will start seeing me anywhere, will start looking for me in all of the wrong places. And so he says to them, in an earlier telling of the ascension story in the Gospel of Luke, he says to them, "Stay here. Stay here. Where I am coming, you cannot come. Stay here." And you can think of the physicality and the juxtaposition of that scene, the contrast. Stay here. Sit down here. The literal translation of that verb reads. And so as Jesus is rising up, he calls all of those around him to stay, to sit down. And he must have known that they longed to follow him upward into some cloudy, idyllic existence at the right hand of God, away from the confusion and the chaos and the pain. But as he is rising up, he says to them, "Stay here. Sit down." And then as they crane their necks, they hear those words, "Well, why do you stand there looking up at the sky?" Why do we look up? Well, because that's the easier view, isn't it? And we stand on that peak looking upward, hearing that promise, looking for that kingdom He told us about. But if we look down again, we see the reality of what is, not the possibility of what can be. We see the reality that no matter how many memorial days we have acknowledged, how many lives lost, how many sacrifices given, humanity has not learned the things that make for peace. We look down and we see vulnerable people overrun again, forgotten again, further victimized even more. We look down and we see another incident of hatred, hysteria, violence. People of Galilee, why do you stand looking up? Because it's so often easier to believe when you're staring at the sky. Then again, maybe you remember another time in the Gospels when two men appear. Two men in dazzling clothes, and they stand beside the women who had come to the tomb on Easter morning, and those men also ask a question: why do you look for the living among the dead? Because it seems that the followers of Jesus have this way of looking for God in the wrong places. And how often are we left gazing up into the clouds, looking for the risen Christ, acting as though He's elevated and beyond us in a place that we have to strive to reach or strain our necks to see. But that kind of crick in the neck spirituality doesn't hear the call of Jesus that says to lower your gaze, to look around, to catch sight of Christ in this world, to make Christ known there, to be a witness yourself, to plant your feet in the name of justice and righteousness and truth, to ground yourself in a commitment to this kingdom that He has told us about, to sit down in the places of pain and suffering and loss. For down the slope of that mountain, down from this Mount of Ascension, there are still people who can be caught up in a vision of a new community of the risen Christ. And so as they head down the mountain and into this city, we read ahead, and the book of Acts tells us that there in that city to which He sends them, day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. And that doesn't happen, you see, if the people that are gathered there around the risen Christ just keep their eyes on the sky. That doesn't happen if the people of God just stay hovering at 2,000 feet in the air. My friend, Reverend Heidi Newmark, is pastor of Trinity Lutheran Church in New York, and not long ago, she shared a story of a time when this kingdom we so often view as high and lofty was known here on earth as it is in heaven, in her neighborhood. In a Christian Century article a few years back, Heidi shared how she had received a Facebook message from a colleague on the other side of the country. He wrote from Los Angeles to tell her about a young woman that he knew who was now living in Brooklyn with her husband and her two young sons. And this family had not yet connected to an East Coast church. But he had reached out to Pastor Newmark because they were in a place of what Heidi called the shadowlands of trauma. Because the youngest of their two sons had a rare terminal illness. And so this Brooklyn-based family was spending nearly all of their time in the pediatric intensive care unit of a Manhattan hospital where their son was receiving care, not far from the neighborhood where Heidi's church was located. And Heidi Newmark herself was actually in her own hospital bed when she got this Facebook message. She had just come out of hip surgery, and it would be a few weeks before she was up and about. And so in that church of a very small staff, she asked her seminary intern from Union Theological Seminary if she could go and be with this family, offer a touch and some care. And it ended up that this intern spent quite a bit amount of time with them, praying and waiting and weeping and listening and sitting. It ended up that this intern helped Charlie, the 5-year-old brother, come to say his goodbyes. It ended up that she stayed beside Charlie's parents as they hung on the edge of impossible decisions. And it ended up that eventually Heidi Newmark and this intern did the funeral for this child. His family absolutely breathless with their shock and their loss, and 5-year-old Charlie standing there behind his parents' legs at the service. Well, it was within a few weeks of this unimaginable loss that this family began pulling themselves up, taking one step in front of the other, and they started on Sundays to come to Trinity Church because they had found a church home, this bond tethered by that shared sorrow. And many Sundays when they attended, Charlie, 5 years old, would hide behind his parents' legs. He rarely spoke. He didn't want to go to Sunday school, but he sat with his dad and he drew pictures of cars and rockets, like the one illustrating a prayer of his that was in the funeral order of worship, a prayer that Charlie had spoken before his brother passed away. Dear God, please send us a rocket ship so that we can go to the stars. Eventually, Charlie did decide to go to Sunday school. His father went with him and was seated nearby. And one Sunday, the teacher had prepared a lesson on Tabitha. You know that story of Peter later in the book of Acts raising Tabitha, just as he had seen Jesus do to Lazarus. And also how after her death, the widows that Tabitha had clothed had held her presence close through the fabric of her woven tunics that they kept. And the teacher, as she was telling this story, suddenly panicked. Wouldn't little Charlie wonder why Jesus did not bring his brother back like Tabitha? Wouldn't he wonder why God hadn't answered his prayers and those of his parents? But then the most amazing thing happened. This quiet little boy, drawn out somehow by this story, for the first time ever in this class, began to speak. And he told this class of preschoolers to second graders that his brother had died, but that Jesus had raised his brother too, and that his brother was with Jesus in heaven, and yet that his brother was also still with him. And he showed the class this woven bracelet that reminded him of his brother, just as the widows must have shown Peter those woven tunics. And the class sat there, transfixed, perfectly still. Every eye and every ear was focused on the testimony of their Sunday school classmate who had walked in the valley of the shadow of death and now was speaking to them about it. And then there was one little girl in the class who Heidi speculates probably knows something of the pain that Charlie was describing. This little girl was born with drugs in her system, raised by her grandmother while her mother is in and out of treatment. This little girl's name is Heaven. And Heaven spontaneously got up and went over, and she gave her classmate Charlie a hug. And then following her example, Heidi says that every child in the class got up, and one by one, they hugged this little brother in Christ, and they hugged his father. Sometimes the distance between us and the divine is about 3 feet. And sometimes it thins out, and it's even shorter than that. But when that happens, it's not because we've been swept up into the clouds. You see, when that happens, it's because heaven touches earth. And that doesn't stop when Jesus ascends. That happens in the lives of these who follow him, not only to this elevated mount, but those who follow him then back down into the world that God so loves. It happens in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria. It happens in Manhattan. It happens in Greensboro. It happens unto the ends of the earth. And Jesus has a word for it. You are my witnesses. And dear God, let it be. Amen.